from KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. On air and online, this is Intersection.
Hello and welcome to Intersection, where people and ideas meet online and on KBIA. I'm Ryan Famuliner. Later this week, MU will host a panel discussion exploring the civil rights history of the university. The talk, which takes place this Thursday night at the Missouri Theater, is just one of a number of events scheduled across town to honor Black History Month. Locally, much has improved since the days of Jim Crow, but some believe that more can be done to make Columbia a more inclusive community. Today on Intersection, we'll take a look back at some of the civil rights gains at the university and the town at large, and talk about the lessons that can be learned from them. Joining me in studio, Michael Middleton is MU's Deputy Chancellor. Prior to that, he was a professor in the University's School of Law. He was also the first African-American student to enroll and graduate from MU's law school. Michael, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
And Bill Horner is a professor of political science at MU and the co-author of a book on Lloyd Gaines, who was an early civil rights pioneer who challenged the law school's ban on African-American students. William, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
And we'd also love to hear from you in our audience. If you want to join in on today's conversation, give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet us at intersectkbia. And yeah, so maybe just to start chronologically, I guess, with you, Bill, talking about Lloyd Gaines. First, who was Lloyd Gaines?
Well, Lloyd Gaines was a graduate of Lincoln University. He grew up, at least part of his childhood in St. Louis, and he was a graduate of Vashon High School in St. Louis, and then he went to Lincoln and graduated in 1935. He majored in history. He was an honors graduate. He was president of his class in 1935, and then he became part of an ongoing effort of the NAACP to challenge segregation in institutions all over the country, but Missouri was one place that they were interested in pursuing, and so Gaines ended up walking into the office of the attorneys in St. Louis that were sort of handling things at a more local level for the national NAACP, and that's sort of how the process got started.
Right. And his legal challenge was a pretty big one. I mean, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Oh, absolutely, sure. Yeah, no, he and his attorneys at the national level was Charles Houston, who was the sort of coordinator of the legal efforts for the NAACP nationally, and he worked very closely with Thurgood Marshall. At the local level, there were a couple of attorneys, Sidney Redmond and Henry Espy in St. Louis, and together they Gaines applied for admission to the law school, and sort of in the process of making that application, made it known that he was African American, and in requesting his transcript from Lincoln, made it quite clear that he was African American, and at which point the university just sort of sat on his application and didn't do anything with it, and so there was some effort made to get court order to essentially force the university to acknowledge the application, make a decision on the application, and then it proceeded from there. Once the board of curators officially voted, which it's hard to imagine the board of curators getting involved in an individual student admission ordinarily, but it was a board of curators vote ultimately to decide not to let him in, and so then the suit was filed in Boone County Courthouse, and that was heard there in 1936. And they lost at the circuit court level, and it went to the Missouri Supreme Court, and they lost at the Missouri Supreme Court, which was all okay as far as the NAACP was concerned, because they had won a fairly significant victory in Maryland in a case called Murray versus Pearson, that desegregated the law school at the University of Maryland. But the problem was that Maryland chose not to pursue that case to the Supreme Court, which is what they really needed to have happen so that they could set that national level precedent. And so that was all okay. It was expected that they were going to lose all along the way, and so then the case was heard in the U.S. Supreme Court at the end of 1938.
Right. And Michael Middleton, what was your perspective on that as an MU law student as well? And we'll talk more about the significance of that for you personally later too. But I guess what did you think about this case in the scheme of civil rights here in Missouri, I guess specifically, and across the country?
Well, this case was an important case in the civil rights movement generally. Interesting to note, the Murray case, the NAACP picked University of Maryland for their initial lawsuit because Thurgood Marshall had been denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School. Mm. So he decided to do his law school.
Yeah.
And you're right, he was shocked when the state court simply agreed and the university agreed to integrate. So Missouri was the number 2 target. No, I was aware of the Gaines case when I was contemplating law school, and it was a motivator for me, as it was for many people in the early 60s who were involved in the civil rights movement. The other thing that's interesting is that Lloyd Gains was a fraternity brother of mine, so I knew of him through fraternity lore as well.
Well, and we should mention too, I guess what happened to Lloyd Gaines. We don't really know, I guess, as part of the story.
Yeah, that's the troubling part. After and I don't want to steal from the book, and I don't want to get anything wrong from the book, but my recollection is that while awaiting appeals, when the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's ruling was in effect that the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson was the standard, right, and ordered that the state of Missouri either admit Lloyd Gaines to the University of Missouri Law School or create a separate but equal law school for African Americans in Missouri. The response to that was that the state authorized the establishment of a Lincoln University School of Law. They rented or bought a building in St. Louis. I think they invested a couple $100,000 in books for a law library, and they hired 2 or 3 professors, lawyers, to be professors. So then the question for the NAACP was whether the Lincoln Law School was in fact equal to the University of Missouri Law School. They went back to court. The Supreme Court remanded the case back to the state court. They came back to Boone County Court. They were apparently preparing for a hearing to determine whether the Lincoln Law School was equal to the Missouri Law School. And while preparing, someone asked, well, where is Lloyd? Yep. Lloyd did not show up to help the lawyers prepare. What they discovered was that Lloyd had been in Chicago at the Alpha House, the fraternity house, living there. He left the frat house one evening, allegedly to go buy some stamps, according to the reports that were made, left the fraternity house and was never seen again. And so no one knows what happened to Lloyd Gaines. I heard a story, and I don't know that you've heard it in doing your book, but there was a judge in East St. Louis, Billy Jones, who reported to someone that he was with Lloyd Gaines in St. Louis and saw him get on a train to Columbia. That was the last reported sighting I've heard of Lloyd Gaines, but I don't know that I got. Have you heard anything like that?
We have. We've heard lots of different stories.
Yeah, lots of theories.
Yeah. There are many theories, and of course, the story has evolved over time too, because initially there was some, and the letter, he wrote a letter to his mother, which indicates, if you read the letter, suggests some great frustration on his part with the process and the pressure of being involved, being the center of this incredible, legal battle and considerable negative, reaction to it. And so the letter reads, he says things in there about, if you don't hear from me, don't worry about me. And he says, there's a great passage, which I can't do off the top of my head, unfortunately, but a very eloquent passage about how I'm not a great man. People want to make me a great man. Sometimes I wish I was just an ordinary man. And so, I think at the time there was speculation that he had maybe had enough.
Made himself disappear.
But when somebody disappears and isn't heard from, for years and years and years and years, you imagine if somebody has relocated, eventually somebody's going to see them. So that then becomes speculation about whether or not he met a violent end, and we just We don't know.
Right. I need to take I'm sorry. I'll get
Sure,
to-
go ahead.
I just need to take a moment to remind our audience this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famulner, and today we're taking a look back at some of the civil rights issues at the university and the town at large and talking about the lessons that can be learned from them. Joining me in studio, Michael Middleton is MU's Deputy Chancellor. He was also the first African-American student to enroll and graduate from MU's law school. William Horner is a professor of political science at MU and the co-author of a book on Lloyd Gaines, who was an early civil rights pioneer who challenged the law school's ban on African-American students. And now joining us by phone, Mary Ratliff is the president of the state chapter of the NAACP. She's lived in Columbia since 1959. Mary, thanks for joining us. And for you and our audience, how inclusive is MU? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet us at intersectkbia. Okay, sorry, Deputy Chancellor Middleton, sorry for interrupting you there.
No, I was thinking another rumor I heard, consistent with the notion that Lloyd Gaines may have just gotten frustrated and wanted to get away. Dr. Lorenzo Green, noted historian from Lincoln University, said at one time that he heard a rumor that Lloyd Gaines was in Mexico, the country of Mexico.
Yes.
And he apparently took a trip down there looking for Lloyd Gaines, got to a town where someone told him there was an African-American man from Missouri working at a coal mine, I believe, in the area. And Lorenzo went looking for him, but couldn't find him. So,
Well, and I think had gone so far as to arrange to meet for lunch.
Is
I
that
think,
right?
And showed up at the restaurant, and
he didn't
Gaines
show
did not
up.
come, right? Yeah.
so who knows what happened? But it's a tragic story. But you can't deny the toll that ordeal must have taken on Lloyd Gaines.
Sure.
Lloyd Gaines, was the valedictorian of his high school graduating class, magna cum laude from Lincoln. I think he wanted, in fact, to be a teacher, but he was basically recruited into this movement to serve as the ultra qualified plaintiff in this lawsuit. And that's the way we lawyers, that's the way the civil rights litigation model goes.
Yeah.
You find a target defendant, and you find a squeaky clean, ultra-qualified plaintiff. You have him apply for the job or for admission or whatever it is that the barrier you're trying to break. So there can be no dispute as to his objective qualifications. That simply bolsters your case that, well, if they rejected him, it was because of his race. Right. Of course, in this case, it was clear that it was because of his race.
Right.
But Lloyd Gaines stepped up and gave himself to the movement. And he was a part of a great victory. But you always question the benefit that plaintiff derives from that kind of courage.
Well, and that's really the point, right? In a sense, it doesn't. I mean, it is a great mystery of history, right? What happened to Gaines? But in either case, it's a very sad story, because no matter what reason he disappeared for, it's because of he was basically really just put through the grinder in this process as being part of this and playing this heroic role that somebody had to play.
And then, so how long did it take, though, for MU to then become desegregated after this case?
1950 was the first. There was a small group of students that were pursuing, and it was all graduate education in the beginning, and that was part of Charles Houston's plan with the NAACP, was to use graduate education. And one of the reasons that states like Missouri and Maryland were targets were because they and Missouri was sort of unfortunately, it's good to be a pioneer in some things, but Missouri was a pioneer in offering scholarships for African American students to go out of state to study. Because there was no law school at Lincoln at the time when Gaines filed his suit.
So that's how they handled the separate but equal, right? Is by saying we can send you somewhere else completely separate out of the state.
And just as always the case with separate but equal, facilities were never equal, and the scholarships that were offered were nowhere near enough to pay the expenses of somebody to go and study. Beside the fact that you're a tax-paying citizen of the state of Missouri, you should be able to go to the institution in the state of Missouri. So anyway,
and who's to say that? Who can say that law education in Kansas is equal to one in Missouri.
Well, but that was one of the amazing things that the state tried to argue. Was
Yeah.
that the law school in the case tried to argue. They had the dean of the law school on the stand here in the Boone County Courthouse arguing that there was no particular advantage to studying law in the state of Missouri if you wanted to practice law in the state of Missouri, that you could get just as good an education in Illinois or Kansas. So, I mean, it was a ridiculous
Yeah.
Right.
conceit.
Right.
And that, the first thing they tried to argue was that Lincoln University was a substandard institution, when all along, the case that they had made to justify segregation in the first place in higher education was that Lincoln was the equal of the University of Missouri. So the first thing that they considered arguing, and they floated this argument, and there's great memos from Charles Houston about this, is he's thinking, let them make that argument.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And, but they were originally going to argue that no student from Lincoln could be possibly qualified to go to law school at the University of Missouri. And they shifted from that to arguing that there was nothing special about the University of Missouri Law School. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it was a ridiculous exercise.
I'd like to bring in Mary real quick. Mary, why do you think that Gaines is a significant figure? We've been talking about this a little bit here, but
as Mike was saying, I think that it's significant that he, when we are looking for civil rights people, as Mike has said, we are looking for someone who can cleanly represent the community. And that when we can see no other reason except for the fact that the color of their skin, when we're trying to make breakthroughs, in racial disparity cases. And I think that it's important for Lloyd Gaines or any Lloyd Gaines or Rosa Parks or any of those kinds of people that are willing to really to really go out on the limb. To make society better, because that's what they do. The price that he paid, we don't even know the ultimate price that he paid for deciding to take that step. We know that Rosa Parks had many obstacles thrown in her way when she decided that. So we owe so much to those pioneers who were brave enough to go ahead of us and try to pave a way for us. And Lloyd Gaines is no different. So I think that in his time, he could have with his education from Lincoln University, he could have decided to have been a teacher and gone quietly on his way over there, But for the movement, he was willing to put himself out there, and maybe even possibly gave his life for that cause.
Well, yeah, and everyone, school kids know the name Rosa Parks, but they don't know the name Lloyd Gaines. You can guess about what may have happened if he hadn't disappeared. But yeah, do you think he'd be as revered maybe as someone like that, like you're talking about, in a wider scale?
I would think that certainly he would be one of the people that we would be celebrating during Black History Month and other times. Anytime we have someone who's willing to go that length to stick their necks out, especially during that period of time when it was dangerous. Right. I think yes, he would have been a historical figure that we would be celebrating.
Yeah. Bill, I saw you want to jump in there.
Well, I was going to say, and the deputy chancellor was getting at this. When he at the time he disappeared, they were preparing the next case, and the next case would have been to in a way, for higher education at least, this could have been Brown versus the Board of Education, because the next step was to challenge the obvious fact that the school they set up in St. Louis was not the equivalent of the University of Missouri Law School, and the court seemed inclined. It was a 6-2 decision in Gaines versus Canada. I mean, it was not the 5-4 decisions that we see today in so many cases. It was a pretty solid majority, and it very well could have been that had they been able to pursue this, that Gaines would be. We'd talk about the Gaines decision, in the second case.
Absolutely, could have been.
Yep. I want to take a moment to remind our audience this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today we're taking a look back at some of the civil rights issues at the university and the town at large, and talking about the lessons that can be learned from them. Joining me in studio, Michael Middleton is MU's Deputy Chancellor. He also was the first African-American student to enroll and graduate from MU's law school. William Horner is a professor of political science at MU and the co-author of a book on Lloyd Gaines, who was an early civil rights pioneer who challenged the law school's ban on African American students. And joining us by phone, Mary Ratliff is the president of the state chapter of the NAACP and has lived in Columbia since 1959. We'd also love to hear from you and our audience. Were you involved in the civil rights movement in Columbia? How has the city changed? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet us at IntersectKBIA. We'd like to remind you can watch Intersection as streaming video online during our live conversations every Monday afternoon at 2 at kbia.org. You can watch that video and join our online chat by going to kbia.org and scrolling down to the link for Intersection. Again, that's Mondays at 2 online at kbia.org. And Deputy Chancellor Middleton, I've been mentioning it in those intros throughout, but you have a pretty close connection with Lloyd Gains because you were the first African American law student here. So, what was that experience like, knowing the story of Lloyd Gains and being here at the university? I guess 30 years after this fight happened.
Well, first let me make one correction. I wasn't the first.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, when when MU integrated, Lincoln Law School became unnecessary, and they closed it down. I was told by Dean Willard Eckhart when I came here to law school that when Lincoln Law School closed, there were 6 or 7 African American students who, in fact, were admitted into MU's law school to complete their legal education. The interesting thing was, though they graduated, they didn't get MU degrees. They were retroactively given Lincoln degrees. That was, I think, in the 50s. I came to MU as a freshman in '64, and I entered law school in '68. There were 2 African Americans in law school in '68, both of whom had transferred from Howard University Law School. They went there for a year or 2 and came back to Mizzou for the express purpose of getting an MU law degree because they were both from Missouri. One, Harold Holliday from Kansas City, whose father was a state legislator, and one, Linwood Evans from St. Louis. So there were 2 older fellows in their second and third year when I came in as a first-year student in the law school. They helped me immensely. They knew the ropes. They were at least someone I could talk to, someone who could take me under their wings and help out. So I was the first to enter as a freshman and graduate as a 3L, but I don't want to take any of the recognition away from those who preceded me as law students.
Sure.
It was not easy. It was, my first year, indeed my undergraduate and law school careers were interesting. I say it wasn't, let me precede this with the fact that I was born in Mississippi. I'm well aware of segregation and racism, and because that's what I grew up with. So it wasn't shocking to come to Columbia or to come to MU because the atmosphere was very much like the atmosphere was in Mississippi growing up. So it may surprise you to realize that it wasn't a shock. It was just more of the same that I grew up fighting against. So I could deal with it, but it wasn't pleasant. I mean, to be in a classroom and not be called on ever, and not know if they were not calling on you because they thought you were a dummy and they were protecting you, or were they not calling on you because they just didn't want to interact with an African American. I mean, those thoughts go through a student's mind. Or when you do get addressed, it's on a race issue. You're the expert on that. So those kinds of things happened all the time throughout undergraduate and throughout law school. But even as I say that, there were professors and there were colleagues, other students, who were a bit more progressive and welcoming, and you gravitate to those folks who will interact with you, and you get by. I still have some very good friends from law school. Some of my classmates, study partners, are to this day, here some 40 or 50 years later, good friends. So it wasn't as bad as some may think, but it was a whole lot worse than others may think.
If I can ask, how did the I'm fascinated at the notion of how the undergraduate experience compared to your law school experience in those terms, and of how you were accepted and what the experience was like.
It was about the same. It took me a year of law school. Back in those days, a third of law students didn't get past their first year. Once I made it through the first year, I was much more accepted. I mean, people began to say, "Oh, he must be."
He's for real.
Yeah, he's for real.
Yeah.
And so it was much better in the second and third year than the first year. In the first year, I was pretty much isolated. I just didn't know anybody, and no one wanted to deal with me.
Were you able to kind of get past the idea that it was something about you, and the idea of it's their approach, not you? You know what I mean?
I learned that as a very young child.
Yeah.
That when racism, when you're faced with racism, it's not about you; it's about them. Moreover, it's important not to be angry or judgmental about them. Racism is something that people learn, and a kid, a young adult, or even an older adult who has this, in our view, inexplicable notion of racial inferiority, can't help it. That's what they learned, and being angry or vindictive is not a solution. You need to help them work through it. Demonstrate to them that they're wrong. Don't tell them they're wrong necessarily. Demonstrate to them that they're wrong, and perhaps you move the ball forward. So no, it was never an internal doubt about me. It was more sadness about them.
You mentioned some of the students that reached out to you, but was there anywhere on the campus that you did feel welcome or comfortable? I mean, I guess maybe it got better as time went on, but.
Yeah, I met some friends in the residence hall, in Jones Hall. In fact, the former poet laureate of Missouri, Walter Bargan, lived down the hall from me over in Jones Hall. Good guy, got to be a good friend. In law school, I had several good friends that I hung with, studied with. One of our curators now, John Phillips, was a study partner of mine in law school. So, yeah, I mean, there were people who were genuinely good people, good progressive people. But the vast majority of people, I mean, when you're walking across campus to go to class and someone throws a half-empty beer can out of a car window and yells, "Go home," N-word, and that's your greeting on your first day on campus, it kind of goes downhill from there.
Well, we're going to have to take a quick break. We'll continue this discussion after that break. This is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. Today, we're taking a look back at some of the civil rights issues at the university and the town at large, and talking about the lessons that can be learned from them. Our guests in studio today are Michael Middleton, Bill Horner, and Mary Ratliff. I'm Ryan Famuliner. We'll be right back after a short break.